Hey guys.
Okay. I'm sorry to traumatize you. If we're gonna have to do another video recording like this, let's at least make it a little fun or terrifying. But the reason why I'm here is because obviously somebody probably already told you I got this deal. 2 lines means that I got COVID, so I've got that. I don't feel too bad. I am really just genuinely bummed because today we are going to be kicking off a new 7-week series on the book of Daniel, an Old Testament story in which we are going to learn a lot from. The reason why we are taking a look at the book of Daniel is because I know that a lot of you guys don't interact a ton with the Old Testament, nor do you know how to draw the meaning and purpose out of a narrative story like Daniel in the Old Testament. So for those of you who weren't here, we just finished up our series covering, every essential doctrine of, Christianity. But now I wanted to take a turn, start to do real narrative verse by verse exposition. And we are going to start looking at the purpose and the relevance of the book of Daniel within our own lives. I apologize for the horrible quality on this video. I bet the audio is going to be just as bad, but it's the only thing to where I can share my screen with you guys as I run through the PowerPoint. Hopefully now you can see my screen. Boom. Book of Daniel. Boom. All right, guys. So before we dive into the text or anything like that, I just want to give you guys a good, huge overview of the book and, the details that surround it so that you guys can study this as scholars or students of the word. Okay, so people who are a lot smarter than me have made the assessment that the book of Daniel was written in this time frame, 540 to 530 BC. Okay, so just in case you guys are wondering what the heck was going on in the earth in 540 to 530 BC, you had the Mayan civilization peaking down in Mexico. Mayan civilization is over here. I don't know if you can see on the right, but that's the Mayans. Who else do we have? Somewhere in Nepal, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, is doing his thing, even though I sounded Italian right there. He is doing his thing. He's alive and well in modern day in Nepal. And then Aesop, the Greek guy, is writing his fables somewhere in Greece. This is how old the book of Daniel is. This is what was going on at the earth during this time, okay? However, meanwhile, in the midst of all of these things, God's chosen people, the Israelites, were being destroyed. And then they were shipped off to Babylon because they refused to obey him. That's pretty heavy, but this is the setting for the book of Daniel that we are going to be discussing over the next 7 weeks. The book of Daniel shows us how God punished his people for their sin, yet somehow remained faithful in the promise that he had given to them. All right, so to start with a brand new book like the book of Daniel, let's read from an entirely different book of the Bible. So what we're about to read on this screen is written in about 720 BC. You saw that Daniel was written somewhere from 540 to 530. This was written 220 years before Israel was hauled off to Babylon in the Babylonian captivity. All right, these next words are the words of Isaiah the prophet. If you want to open a Bible, you can find them in Isaiah 39. This says, "Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, 'Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace, all that your predecessors have stored up until this day, will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord, and some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon.'" So that is what Isaiah is describing in his prophetic word in Isaiah 39. Now, let's go ahead and fast forward 220 years. And this is when we're going to get the book of Daniel. I want you guys to look one more time at this prophecy from Isaiah before we read the first chapter of Daniel, just so you can have it in your mind that exactly what Isaiah was saying is coming to pass later in Daniel's time. Focus on, I can't highlight it, but the portion starting in verse 6. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, are going to be taken away, and they're going to become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now we're skipping to Daniel, starting in verse 1. I apologize if I'm going fast. I'm talking to a screen, so I have no sense of time. Let's do this. Daniel 1. Keeping in mind the prophecy that we just read from Isaiah, Daniel 1:1. In the third year of the king of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure of the house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, probably terrorizing these names, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, just as Isaiah had said, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. You know some of those names. Uh-oh, I went too far. I'm going back. So, everything that is happening within the context of the book of Daniel right now is 100% in the hand of God. God is orchestrating what we see, and we have seen that because it was prophesied with the prophets of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and it was even mentioned somewhere in 2 Kings. So I just want to remind you guys one more time that the purpose of this book that we are covering, not to bore you, not to keep driving home, but to really remind you of the true point of the text. The purpose of this text is to show us how God punished his people for their sin, yet how it somehow remained faithful in the promise that he had given to them. So in Daniel chapter 1, we watch as the Israelites get whisked away to Babylon and become captive in a foreign culture, but yet somehow God has it within his plan that some of those from the royal family are going to be chosen to help Israel acclimate to the Babylonian culture. Sounds like my voice is going out. In come our main characters. We have Daniel, obviously. Then we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we are going to watch how God accomplishes his purpose through these 4 men. But first, I want to share my screen with you guys once again. And note on a piece of archaeological evidence. Okay? So the stone that you are seeing before you is called the Nebuchadnezzar Barnacle, and it dates back to the date in which the book of Daniel was written, and it confirms the siege of Babylon on Jerusalem. So this is what the words on your left say. In the 7th year, obviously, of Nebuchadnezzar in this time, in the months of Chislev, the king of Babylon assembled his army after he had invaded the land of Hatti. He laid siege to the city of Judah, Jerusalem. On the 2nd day of the month of Adar, he conquered the city and took the king prisoner. He installed in his place a king of his own, And after he had received a rich tribute, he sent forth to Babylon. So there is a piece of archaeology that confirms this event within history, but let's keep going in Daniel 1 and review verses 8 and 9. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. So even though Daniel was getting the very best of the best here, he had it in his mind beforehand that he was going to obey the law of Moses instead of just doing whatever the Babylonians wanted him to do. Now, his law, the law of Moses, commanded that Daniel was not to eat the food that was being served to him. One, because it was not kosher, and in the law, it was written that they are not to consume the food that they were being served. Two, we can also assume that the food that was being served to the king was probably used in part to sacrifice to idols, which was also condemned in the law of Moses. So let's skip ahead here and see what happens. Daniel remains faithful to God, and he cuts a deal with the official who is overseeing him. Now, the official does fear the king, though, so he does not want Daniel and his friends to look malnourished when he has this program to build up and establish men from the nation that they just took captive. Daniel responds to the official in this next passage. These are verses 12 through 17. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearances with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of these 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were going to drink, and he gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So what we are seeing in this passage is that Daniel remains faithful to God, despite the fact that he had his butt hauled off to a world that has a God for just about every city that exists, and nobody even cares about Daniel in the first place. Personally, I believe that we all can at least draw 2 big takeaways from these verses. 1, learn from Daniel that you can obey God and should obey God regardless of the circumstances that you are in. You guys thought that public schools were bad? Imagine being exiled in ancient Babylon coming from the city of Jerusalem. That's probably a little bit more of a culture shock. Daniel did not fit in for a second. No one thought in the way that he did. Nobody thought, even remotely in the way that he did. Belief in God was quite literally a foreign concept to the Babylonians. But look at Daniel go. That did not stop him. Obey God regardless of the circumstance or surrounding that you are in. The second point that we can draw from this is like it. Have the integrity to be prepared. Know what you believe in what you are going to do before the inevitable happens. We are going to face trials just as Daniel has in his own life. Understand what you desire and what is first in your heart before you end up compromising. How many times have you guys ended up compromising because you didn't have your course of action set before you went into a situation? In matters of both faith and integrity, we often end up compromising because we don't know what we want beforehand. So here is the last section from Daniel 1. Starting in verse 18, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So here's what we have learned in reading the first chapter, just the first chapter of the book of Daniel. We've seen God's people turned away from him initially. They were then warned by the prophets, and then they were taken over by Babylon and exiled. Yet God was still faithful. And in this first chapter, we are already seeing how God has started his work in the lives of these 4 individuals, Israelites, who are living in the heart of the foreign city, Babylon. And now they've displayed better understanding, better wisdom, better knowledge, better interpreters than even that of 10 times those who the king had already had doing their job previously. God is doing something with his people, and he has not, and he never will give up on them. That is our big takeaway from the book of Daniel. All right, guys, that's it for our first chapter in the book of Daniel. Hopefully this video was able to communicate something to you guys. As you can see on the screen in front of me, hopefully you guys can see this as well. There are a couple of questions that I want you guys to discuss in your small groups if there is time. I will leave this to whoever has taken control and is leading over you guys, but yeah, discuss these questions. We will have a discussion again on Sunday morning. I probably won't be there, and we're still figuring out the logistics of that, but know that there will be a time for you guys at Sunday morning at 9:30. Yeah, thank you. I hope to see you guys again soon. That's it from me. Peace out, Don. Yeah.